Things are picking up in Ukraine on both sides. After months of an almost exclusive focus at Bakhmut, the last few days have seen a pretty significant spike in activity. From Russian aircraft falling out of the sky to a massive detonation in western Ukraine and continued heavy fighting around Bakhmut that just cost Russia the lives of 2 colonels. First, a quick thank you to today's sponsor, Gunspot. Gunspot is an online auction site for both new and used firearms, accessories, and quite a bit more. Right now, Gunspot is running a giveaway for the Pit Viper from John Wick 4. You can register on their website or their Facebook page, and the winner will be announced on June 5th. All state and local laws apply. Okay, on Saturday, May 13th, reports came out that Russia lost 4 aircraft in a pretty short period of time. There's a lot still unknown here, and we're getting conflicting reports from the two sides, but I'm pretty confident in saying that 2 Mi-8 helicopters, an Su-34 bomber, and an Su-35S fighter were all destroyed. Initial reports from inside of Russia were that these aircraft crashed, but I wouldn't read too much into that. Whatever happened here, it pretty clearly was a surprise to the Russian military leadership, and given where the events took place, crashing is a pretty logical assumption, at least for the first one. All aircraft were down around Khmelnytsky, a town about 40 kilometers inside of the Russian border. And as of today, May 15th, there are still sources on both sides running with all sorts of explanations as to what happened here, but at the end of the day, none of them are good for Russia. The first theory that gained some pretty serious traction was the idea that this was a friendly fire incident, so Russian air defenders shooting down Russian aircraft. I'd say this is supported by the fact that it happened so far inside of Russian airspace, but it does raise some questions about why, all of a sudden, a battery or 2 of Russian air defenders got trigger happy with their own aircraft, especially when they're not right on the front and wouldn't be expecting Ukrainian jets overhead. I'm not very confident in the friendly fire story right now. It's just, taking down 1 helicopter or 1 jet accidentally, sure, but 4? We have heard stories about how the Russian chain of command, especially between organizations like the Air Force and the Air Defense assets, isn't quite as tight as it could be, but this seems excessive. Early in the war, Russia had this problem where the Air Defense assets and Air Force weren't super tied in, but even then, I don't remember 4 friendly fire incidents back to back to back like this. The other 3 theories then are tied to Ukraine bringing down these aircraft. Now, official Ukrainian sources have been pretty quiet on this front, but I wouldn't take that to mean too much. If this was Ukraine, there's good reason for them to not really want to publicize their actions. It did happen inside of Russia, after all, and while many in the Ukrainian government and country, for that matter, want to see targets inside of Russia attacked, the official stance of the government tends to be silence when anything on that front comes up. Okay, so on to the next one, which is getting a little less traction than the friendly fire story, and it's the idea that Ukrainian forces snuck across the border to an area where these Russian aircraft weren't expecting any sort of threat and destroyed the targets with man-pads. You could also add in here a local partisan group that was maybe armed by Ukraine to carry out a mission like this. This is the stance that Igor Girkin, a pro-Russian military blogger, seems to be taking, saying that, quote, "As a professional, I cannot but appreciate the brilliant operation of disrespectful Ukrainian colleagues in relation to a one-day, one-time defeat by man-pads of 4 air targets in our deep rear," end quote. The third theory being floated out there is the possibility that a Ukrainian air defense asset, like a Patriot or an S-300, was moved closer to the border in an area that maybe they hadn't been previously deployed. At this point in the war, it's likely that Russia has mapped the general area of Ukrainian radar sites, which would allow them to understand, roughly, the limits of Ukrainian air defense missiles. So an air defense raid of sorts, pushed up to the border, execute the mission, and return back to their previous locations, could also be the source here. The last theory that I've only seen circulated a little bit, not nearly as much as the first 3, is that the aircraft were brought down with air-to-air missiles. Now, there has been some talk of the U.S. sending the AIM-120 AMRAAMs to Ukraine for just this purpose, but as of now, there hasn't been any confirmation on a decision there. Now, for reference, the AIM-120 Charlie, which is the most likely to be delivered as an export variant, has a range out to past 100 kilometers, meaning that Ukraine could technically have fired these from well inside their own airspace. But even without that, Ukraine does have the R-27 air-to-air missile. It's manufactured in Ukraine, or at least was prior to the start of the full-scale invasion, but it's not exactly clear what the quantities look like across the force. Ukraine's newest models of the R-27 have an advertised range of 170 kilometers. So again, that's something that could be launched well inside of Ukraine to strike targets in Russia. This enters into one of those weird, tricky areas of the war. If Russian aircraft are being used to wage war in Ukraine, then it seems like a no-brainer that Ukraine should be able to target those aircraft anywhere. If Russia is able to fire munitions across the border, shouldn't Ukraine as well? But that's not exactly where the entirety of the international community sits on that issue. And any strike inside of Russia does tend to make most NATO countries just a little bit restless. So R-27, AIM-120, or anything else, I wouldn't expect Ukraine to be quick to claim that strike. It's better, in their case, to just be happy with the results and not worry about the credit. Now, while the Russian Air Force had their worst day in a very long time, a few recent missile strikes did appear to have struck significant targets inside of Ukraine. On May 13th, Russia launched an aerial barrage across Ukraine that included, at the very least, 18 Shahed 136-style drones. Now, Ukraine claims to have shot down most of these, but videos did emerge pretty quickly of at least 2 locations where impacts occurred. The most notable was in Khmelnytsky, apologies on my pronunciation there, which is a town in western Ukraine roughly between Lviv and Kyiv. And the video from this blast was pretty intense and might be the largest explosion I've seen so far in this war. There was a lot of chatter as soon as this surfaced, so I'll try to dissect that a bit. Now, this video here is what I've seen posted most often, and there have been some of the geolocation folks dial it into Khmelnytsky. However, I did see a lot of doubt about whether or not this happened at all. We have a bit of a challenge in understanding the impact when it comes to strikes inside of Ukraine. On the one hand, we've seen Russia claim that factories or military headquarters were hit when the impact was a residential apartment building full of civilians, so most are pretty quick to write off any Russian explanation, which in this case was a pretty short write-up, saying that an ammunition storage facility was destroyed. On the other hand, Ukraine, understandably so, is not going to provide a battle damage assessment for Russia to then use in follow-on strikes. So in this case, there was a lot more news coming out of pro-Russian channels than Ukrainian, which, in my opinion, led to a bit of a skewed balance where the information could be traced back to. I know some folks can look at an explosion like this and say whether or not it was ammunition or if it was fuel or something else entirely. I'm not very confident in my abilities on that front, but it is pretty clear that this was much more than an empty warehouse, and I tend to think it was something significant. My reasoning there is that a few weeks back when Pavlorad was hit, we saw the same hype from pro-Russian channels, but Ukraine was pretty quick to give an explanation of what was actually there. Rather than a warehouse full of air defense missiles, as was claimed, Ukraine said it was old Soviet-era ICBM boosters and a chemical factory. Now, whether you believe that or not, they were quick to give an answer. And that hasn't been the case with Khmelnytsky. There's a lot of news circulating out there, so I absolutely could have missed it, but I haven't seen Ukraine explain yet what went up in flames in that strike. That same night, there was another significant strike in Ternopil, also in the western portion of Ukraine. Here, Russia claims that a railroad and mechanical plant used for the war effort was hit. Ukraine stated that it was a factory for commercial enterprises and home to a religious organization. Of note, Ternopil is the home of the Ukrainians that were taking part in the Eurovision contest in England when these strikes occurred. All right, shifting over to moves on the battlefield. Most of the focus is still on and around Bakhmut, where Ukrainian forces appear to still be pressing to the north and the south. There's no major changes in the last 48 hours in terms of territorial control, but the big news on that front is that 2 Russian colonels were killed in the fighting. On Sunday, May 14th, the Russian Ministry of Defense announced the deaths of the commander of the 4th Motorized Rifle Brigade, Colonel Makarov, and Deputy Army Corps Commander for the military and political work, Colonel Bravko. Both were killed in the ongoing fight for Bakhmut. Now, it's been a while since senior Russian military leaders have fallen in this war, so this is noteworthy. The Russian reports here are that these 2 colonels were helping to organize the defense, but I've seen some Ukrainian commentary that there was a targeted artillery strike a ways behind the front line. Look, either way, losing 2 colonels, 1 a brigade commander, right where the situation is very fluid, has to add some challenges to the Russian defense. Dialing into Bakhmut a little bit, looking at the progress Ukraine has made over the last week, as well as over the last 48 hours. Now, something I think is interesting here is that while Ukraine made these advances to the north and south, Wagner forces continued to push about 500 meters further into the city of Bakhmut itself. Hard to distill much from just looking at the map, other than to say the situation in and around that town is pretty fluid. Stepping back a bit as to what this all means, there was an interesting thread on Telegram a few days ago by a pro-Russian military blogger named Mers, where he said that the Russian units being attacked right now are exhausted, and likely that's why Ukraine is singling them out. He said that these men, the Russian soldiers, had taken part in the fighting in the east over the summer, then moved to Bakhmut, where they've now been fighting for months, adding that rather than change out the unit as an entirety for rest and refit, new mobilized men were simply added to their ranks, saying, quote, "In general, the brigade is significantly exhausted and drained of blood, and the enemy knows it," end quote. He wrapped up by saying that his expectation is that Ukraine is simply trying to dislodge Russian units and force them to fight in lines not well set up for the defense. Then, as they suffer casualties, Russia will be forced to decide between withdrawing further or reinforcing those troops from other locations. He thinks this pattern is going to repeat again at Avdiivka and Marinka, and if Ukraine is successful in each, the overall Russian lines will be substantially weaker overall and may present some opportunities for breakthroughs in certain areas. Those are, in a sense, probing attacks, checking the enemy defenses and forcing them to shift before identifying the best course of action for the main attack. Now, whether or not Mers is correct in his assessment, I think it's fair to say that at Bakhmut, Ukraine has regained the initiative for the time being.